Let's get started. We are at the top of Vav on the base. What I'm going to do, I want to just do a quick review of yesterday, because yesterday was relatively complicated. We had a machlokes. We had three machlokes that we should really be aware of, that we should take away from the sugya. We have the machlokes Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Shmuel, whether or not a shavua on Elisha Ovar is one of the shavuos that you would bring a carbon oil of Yerit for. Right? That was machlokes number one. Then we had machlokes number two, which is the machlokes between Rav and Shmuel. If you made a shvua on Lisha Ovar, that would have been impossible to make on La'asid. Like Reuven threw a rock into the river yesterday. You couldn't make a shvua that Reuven will throw a rock into the river tomorrow because you don't control Reuven. And then the third machlokes that we had was between Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseir and the Rabbanon, whether you could be nishba l'kayim as a mitzvah. Everybody agrees you cannot be nishba to violate a mitzvah, but could you swear, I will shake lulav and esrei? The machlokes there is whether or not you need to have hein and lav, whether a shvua is considered a shvuas bitoi for the purposes of being mechayev a carbon, if you can't swear it both ways. And all these three shilas all focus on the words that the Torah says when the Torah describes what a shavuos bitui is. The Torah describes it as ish oy nefesh kisi shava levate bisfasayim lahara oy lahetiv. That is the focus, lahara oy lahetiv. So lahara lahetiv, black and white, says hein and lav, but it's also clearly mashma lahara and lahetiv are both things that are in the future, not in the past. So Rabbi Shmuel holds if you made a shvua on l'shavar, it doesn't fit the mold, the description, the parameters of l'hara leitiv, which describe a shvua that's in the future. And the Rabbanan that argue on Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira hold that l'hara leitiv means you could either say hein or lav, right? L'hara leitiv. If you make a shvua that you can't make that shvua in both ways, that wouldn't count. And Rav and Shmuel sort of come up the middle, because they're arguing not according to Rabbi Shmuel. According to Rabbi Shmuel, you surely can't make a shvua of Elisha Ovar if you can't make the same thing in Labah, because no matter what, according to Rabbi Shmuel, you cannot make a shvua on Elisha Ovar. When I say you can't make, it means you won't bring a carbon shvua for it. So Rav and Shmuel, they are arguing according to Rabbi Kiva of our Mishnah, and according to the Rabbanan of Rabbi ben Beseira, and the discussion is how makbid are each one of these on sticking to the higher elevated. Would you agree that you could make a shvua on Elisha Ovar, whether or not you could make that same shvua in La'asid? That was one shayla we had yesterday. And the second shayla we had yesterday is a shvua of edus. Someone swears to his friend, I don't know edus for you. So the friend drags him to Bezdin. I know that you have information that could help me in my case. And the witness says, I don't, and I swear that I don't. Is that a shavuos bitui? If you think about it, it's a regular shavuos bitui. You're swearing falsely. The question is, the Torah gave it its own section. Does that remove it from the section of shavuos bitui? And we had a machlokes about that as well. Abai said it remains in the section of shavuos bitui as well. So you would really be chayiv two shavuos if it wasn't for the fact that the Torah says achas. We also know that the shavuos edus is chayiv a carbon even if it's bemazed, and the shavuos bitui you don't bring if it's bemazed. And the sheet of Rava is that once the Torah carves out a new place for a shavuos edus, it's no longer relevant at all to shavuos bitui. Those were really the complicated discussions we had yesterday, which takes us to today's Gemara, which should be much easier. Zok the Gemara. Reb Shmuel Omer einei chayiv al ha'asad lavai. You're not chayiv if you make ella al ha'asad lavai. You're not chayiv on the shvua about something that occurred in the past. You're only chayiv for a shvua of you committing yourself to do something in the future. Tanu Rabban lahara oy lahetiv. Those same words. Ainli el dvarim sheyesh behan harav atava. I would think that the only type of a shvuah that you would bring a carbon for, meaning a shvuah that is considered a shvuah bitul halacha, is only if it has hara and a tov. What about hara v'tov? Means it has an impact. It's relevant. It's something of importance. But she'ein v'ein hara v'tov. What if I'm swearing about something that has no benefit to mankind? Rashi gives an example, the very top Rashi, she'ezrek shor layom. Whether or not you throw a rock into the yam is completely irrelevant to anybody. So if that's what the shavu is about, where it does not have a ra, nor does it have a tava, minayin, how do you know that such a shavu is also included in the category of shavus bitui? Talmud loimer, oy nefesh kisi shava levate v'sosayim. That's much more open. Laharalaytiv is like more like a prat, right? Oy nefesh kisi shava levate v'sosayim is a very wide ranging. It includes any type of shua. Zog to Gemara, ainli ella lehaba. I only know that if I made a shvua on something in the future, I would be chayiv. Lisha'avar minayin. How do you know that you're chayiv even for a shvua on the past? So that's how we know all of these cases are included in the category of shvus bitoi, divrei Rabbi Akiva. That is the words of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Shmuel is much more restricted. Shmuel Omer, lahara aylahetiv is laba. So I disagree with the last thing you said, Rabbi Akiva. L'choy la'asher yivate adam mishvua comes to be marba, even l'shavar. Rather, lahara aylahetiv is direct. It's clear. Dafka laba. Amalei Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva told him, and this is elaborating on what we had in the Mishnah. Im Kain, if you're going to say you have to stick only to the words that the Torah says lahara aylahetiv, well then ainli elad varim sheyesh behen hatava vara. Then huadin the shavuos b'di should only be relevant by something that has an impact. The varim she'ein behen hara v'hatava minayin. Mimelami, I had a drasha, but you obviously are sticking to the letter of the law lahara aylahetiv. Amar Loi, so Bishmon said, no, I also have a ribui. Meribiu hakasav meribakasav. Amalois, Rabbi Akiva said, so once you're going to allow the ribuyim in the pasuk to add additional shvuas to the class of shvuas bitui, even though they don't stick and they don't conform with the lahara or lahetiv, im riba akasav lekach, riba akasav lekach. Then now you can't pick and choose. If you're going to use a riba akasav to say that it's even a shvu that has no relevance will be a shvuas bitui, well, then you should use the riba to teach you that even if the shvu is on the lishavar, it will be in the category of shvus bita. Zog to Gemara, Shapir ka'amalei Rabbi Akiva Rabbi Shmuel. It seems like Rabbi Akiva has a very good taina, right? How can you pick and choose? Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Shmuel sheshimesh es Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana. Rabbi Shmuel, who learned by Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana, shahaya darish es kol ha'torah kula b'klal prat. Darshaned the Torah with the method of klal uprat, which is always much more limiting. Therefore, iyunami darish b'klal uprat. Rabbi Shmuel also darshans this pasuk of lahara lahetiv with a klal uprat, and therefore his conclusion is only to include shavuos that have no impact, but not shavuos of lishavar. The Gemara is going to get into the details. The Gemara is going to go through the mechanics. Rabbi Akiva, sheshimesh es nachem ish gamzu, shahayidarish es kol haTorah kula beriba umiyit. So iyunami darish riba umiyit, and therefore will be more inclusive. And now we're going to get into the details. So Rashi tells us a little about their Rebbeim. So Rabbi Shmuel sheshimesh hagi shmilei Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan must have heard somewhere. Rabbi Shmuel shimesh is Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana. He knew that Rabbi Shmuel's Rebbe was Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana, and Rabbi Akiva's Rebbe was Nachem ish Gamzu. He zoked Gemara weiter. Rabbi Akiva the Darish my Rabbi Akiva the Darish ribuy umute. So let's first analyze Rabbi Akiva's method. We had a whole shtickle once, if you remember correctly, about why Nachem ish Gamzu was called Nachem ish Gamzu. He used to say Gamzu Toiva. So why was he called Nachem ish Gamzu? And we had a Gemara that said that Rabbi Kiva said that Kol Mad Omer Achmana Latav Ovid, and he was a madrega down from his Rebbe who said Gamzul Toifa. And if I remember correctly, the Achroidim were masber that when Nachamish Gamzu said Gamzul Toiva, what he meant is, let's say he found out that he was working on a deal and it fell through. He wouldn't say, no, that was a Dan Shemayim. No, he would say, no, this is good for me. Gamzu l'toiva. So the emphasis was the gamzu. Everything, even the bad things that happened to me, they're l'toiva. Rabbi Kiva wasn't on that same madrega. Rabbi Kiva said, kol ma'da avu rachman l'tav of it. Even though it's a bad thing, yes, there's a cheshbon how indirectly it's going to end up being better for me this way. But Rabbi Nachmish Gamzu looked at everything. No, this is good. So he was at a higher madrega than Rabbi Kiva. But they both darshan riba umiyut. So my Rabbi Kiva, the Darish Ribu Imute, the Tanya we learned. It says in the pasuk. So let's just first of all just look at the pasuk inside first. I don't get confused. Oy nefesh kisi shava levate b'svasai. That would be like the first klal. Lahara oy lahetiv. That's the prat. L'chayla asher yavate adam b'shvua would be the second klal. So let's have a look inside the Gemara. Oy nefesh kisi shava riba. That would be a riba. Lahara oy lahetiv is miyat. L'chayla asher Yivate ha'adam chazav v'riba. Riba umiyot v'riba, riba ha'koil. It includes everything. The first riba includes everything with no exception. My riba, riba koil. Riba kol mili. Every type of shvua. It doesn't matter if it's hein v'lav. It doesn't matter if it's relevant or not relevant. It doesn't matter if it's la'asad or l'shavar. Every shvua is a shvu's bita. Umay miyot. But l'maisa there is a miyot lahar lahetiv. So the Torah is telling us that there is at least one shvua that does not fit into this category. Zok to Gemara, Rabbi Kiva holds it's a miyut of our mitzvah. If you swear, l'kaim is a mitzvah, Zok Rabbi Kiva, that's not considered a Shavuos bita. That's Rabbi Kiva shita, that a dvar mitzvah is not a Shavuos bita. Rabbi Shmuel darshans from a different perspective. Klalu prat. So the same words. Oy nevesh kisi shava levate b'svasayim is a klal. L'hara oy lahetiv is a prat. So klal pratu klal I atadon elo ke'ena prat. Now we're not just taking one thing out, which is in the riboy miyut riboy method. Rather, the prat is going to define what the klal is about, and the klal only includes things that are similar to the prat. Ma prat mefurish laba, just like the prat is referring to the future. Afkol laba, so to any shavua that can be considered a shavuos bitui has to be about the future. Ahani klola lasuye afilu dvarim she'ein behen hara ve'atava. Haba, the kalal helps to include even if it doesn't have an impact, because lahara lahetiv has an impact. We have the klal to be marber, even something that doesn't have an impact. And hani prata, and the prat is going to be mamayit, afilu dvarim she'ein sheyesh b'harav atava, even if it's a relevant issue that you're swearing about, but if it's lisha avar, it is not included. So here's where Duvi asks, why? Look, maybe do it the other way. Maybe the prat should be mamayit, something that doesn't have a rav atava, and let the klal be marbe l'shavar. Why do you use the prat for what you want to apply to, and the klal for what you want to apply to? Maybe you should do it verkehrt. Rabbi Yitzchak, because dumya de lahara ay lahetiv. Any shavuos bitui has to have a similarity to lahara lahetiv. And what does that mean? Mishum. I'm sorry. Rabbi Yitzchak dumya de lahara lahetiv. Misha Yisurai, Mishum Bal Yachel Devarai, Yotis Azu, She'ein Yisurai, Mishum Bal Yachel Devarai. So now Rabbi Yitzchak brings in another component that influences what should be included in the klal of the Shavuos Bitui. The Torah says, Lo Yachel Devarai, in reference to a Bitui society as well. And Lo Yachel Devarai means if you said something, don't violate it by not adhering to what you committed to. That's how he touches lo yachel dvarai. So that, by definition, that means you're swearing about a commitment to do or not to do something in the future, and you have to keep your promise. So therefore, Yotzazu, she'ein isur mishum bal yachal devorei ela mishum bal teshakru. When you're swearing about the past, if you're swearing falsely, you're being mishaker. But when you're swearing about the future, if you don't adhere to your commitment, you are over bal yachal. Let's see Rashi. Lo yachal devorei, lo mashma ela bedavar she'efshir l'dekayim shvuasai. It's only mashma, the lashon lo yachal devorei is, it's something where it's in your control whether or not to be mekayim your shvur or not. V'hainu laba, that's clearly laba. But lo shakru is b'shasha tishbu, while you're swearing lo seitze l'sheker, it shouldn't be a shvu sheker, which means you're obviously swearing about something that had already occurred or not occurred. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avin Amar, Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avin has another reason to explain why Rabbi Shmuel decided to exclude Lisha Avar, but to include items that are of no impact. Amar Kra, it says in the pasuk, Oy nefesh kishi shava levate b'svasayim. Mineu bei, from our pasuk itself. Misha shvua koidemes labitoy. Now here bitoy is being touched as the fulfillment of the shvua. So oy nefesh kishi shava levate b'svasayim. Somebody who swears before the fulfillment, meaning it's a shvua on losit. V'loy shabitoy koidemes l'shvua. Not that the fulfillment of the shvua had already occurred before the shvua, meaning you swore about something in the past. Yotza ze ochalti v'lo ochalti. If you swore about the past, shamaisa koidem l'shvua, the fulfillment of the shvua had already occurred before the shvua came. So that's why Rabbi Shmuel decided to disinclude a shvua of l'sha avar in the parsha of Shavuos Bita. Talmud Rabban says, "Share yevate ha'adam b'shvua." Anything that someone would commit to with a shvua, that's a prat. Who's it a prat? It's prat la'onus. What is the definition of onus? Rashi tells us, prat la'onus, k'demafarish lekamei, like the Gemara will explain, going b'shvua lisha avar. Someone made a shvua about something that happened in the past. He thought he was swearing truthfully, and he turned out he made a mistake. The Gemara is going to shortly ask, what is the definition of swearing falsely by mistake? Right? We know if you swear falsely by mistake, according to Rabbi Kiva, you would bring a korban oil for Shavuos Bita. But if you call forgetting about the past, and because that you swore falsely, if you call that an oinus, so then you won't bring a korban oil. So what would you bring when you make a shvua about the past and you forgot what the past was? So you swore falsely. When do you bring a korban and when don't you bring a korban? Because it seems right now from the Gemara that if you forgot what happened in the past and you swore, which we thought was shoygeg, now the Gemara is identifying as oinus. So then when would you bring a korban if you swore falsely because you forgot about the past? So that's the Gemara is going to discuss. So Adam Shvua prat la'oinus v'nelam, and then he forgot about his shvua prat l'mezid. So mezid does not bring a shvuas a korban oil v'yard. The only type of shvua that brings a korban oil v'yard b'mezid, like we said yesterday, is shvuas eidos. Mimenu, it says v'nelam mimenu. Shenis alma mimenu shvua. He forgot that he made the shvua. You would have thought that it means he forgot the chayfetz. And from there you see al helm shvua chayiv ein chayiv al helm chayfetz. So the first question we would ask is, what is helm shvua and what is helm chayfetz? We don't know yet. The Gemara is going to explain. Amar ha'adam b'shvua. This is oil chol asher yevate ha'adam b'shvua. So from ha'adam b'shvua we learn prat la'anus. How do you see from ha'adam b'shvua prat la'anus? So Rashi says, because while he was a shvua, he had to be an adam, meaning he had his wits about him. He was aware of it. and someone who did not have his wits about him, I mean he didn't remember, that's called an onus. Hey Chidami, what would be the example of an onus that you would not bring a carbon for? This is a famous story. Kedir of Kahana and Ravasi. Of Kahana and Ravasi were both Talmidim of Rav, and sometimes they would have a disagreement as to what Rav said. Right? It's very often two Talmidim have a disagreement. What did Rebbe say in Shir? What did he mean? Right? So if you have a Kaimi Mekamei de Rav, when they were in front of Rav, Mar Omar, one of them would say, Shavuos Hachi Omar Rav. I promise you, I'm making a shvuah that this is what Rav said. Umar Omar, and the other one was so sure of his position that he would say, Shavuos Hachi Omar Rav. He also, L'kamei de Rav, when they went to Rav to ask, what did you really say? Obviously, Omar Kechat Minhayu. He obviously said one way or the other. Omar Lo Yidach. So the other Talmud told Rav, Ano b'shikra shtaboy. So you tell me I made a shvuah sheker? Amar Lo, no. Libach anoscha. Your heart forced you. So it's Rashi. Libach anoscha kesaver hayisa lishava be'emes. You thought you were swearing the truth. So at least we know what onus is, where you're not mechuyev for a carbon of the earth. But we still don't have an example of when you would be chai. Tomorrow we'll share that soon. V'nela mimenu shenis'ala mimenu shavua. Zok to Gemara Yochel shenis'ala, or the Bride says Yochel shenis'ala mimenu chayfetz. Tamadomer b'shvua v'nelam mimenu. Al helam shvua chayiv v'nei chayiv al helam chayfetz. Machaku alei b'marava. They would laugh at what we just learned in Marava, because bishlam is shvua. I understand what it means that you forgot your shvua. Mishkachas la b'loy chayfetz. You could forget the shvua without forgetting the chayfetz. What would be the example? Could go into Amar shvua shelo oichel paschit. A person made a shvua. Shvua, I will not eat paschit. And uchesavar sheoichel kamar. He made a shvua that he won't eat paschit, and he forgot what he swore, and he thought that he swore punfager, that he will eat paschit. The shvuah inshi. He forgot the shvuah, right? He didn't know if he said I will eat or I won't eat. But chav tzedakar, he knew the subject of the shvuah was paschit. He just didn't know was a shvuah prohibiting to eat it or obliging him to eat it. That's a good example of you forgot the shvuah. But where do you have a case of nis'ala mimenu chayfetz? Ela chayfetz v'lo shvuah, what would be the case? Hey chidami, ki goyin the amar shvuah shelo oichel paschit. He made a shvuah, I will not eat paschit, and he took a piece of bread. I'm sorry, uchasaver shel sa'orim ka'amar. But he thought that what he said was not that I won't eat paschit. He forgot the shvuah that he made, and he thought that he said he wouldn't eat paschit. And then he ate paschit thinking that was not covered by his shvuah, so he mixed up the chayfetz. The shvuah also docherle. He remembered that he made a shvuah. Chefta inchi, but he forgot on what he made a shvuah. Zok Gemara, that doesn't make sense to say that's called helam chayfetz, because keep on the chefta inchi lahu. Since he forgot the chayfetz, so he forgot the shvuah. He forgot that he made a shvuah on chitin. At the end of the day, he forgot that he made a shvuah on chitin. Hainu helam shvuah. So that's not a good example. So that's why they were laughing in Marava. You can't have a helam chayfetz without having a helam shvuah. Elo Amar Abelazar da v'da achasi. In fact, it's not two things. Helam chayfetz is helam shvuah, because if you forgot the chayfetz, then you obviously forgot that you swore to ask yourself on what you really did. Maskif la Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef had a kasha. Why would you say that? Alma, maybe chayfetz below shvuah. Alama chayfetz below shvuah la mishkachas. Why are you saying that you cannot find halamas chayfetz without halamas shvuah? I'll show you an example. You could find an example. He made a shvuah, I will not eat paschit. And what happened is he knew that. He knew he wasn't allowed to eat chit. And he went to reach out to take a bagel made out of barley. He had no intention of violating his shvuah. And not knowing, he pulled out a bagel that was made out of chitin, but he thought that it was made out of sa'irin. Uchasaver sa'irmi v'achla, and he ate it. So the shvuah he remembered the shvuah that he made, and you remembered what it was about to prohibit him from eating paschit. But he didn't know what chayvetz he was taking. He thought he was taking soirin when in fact he was taking chit. That doesn't help you at all. Kalum mechayves la carbon, ella amai the toughest biyodei. What are you being mechayiv him a carbon for? For what he actually took into his hand and ate. So he had a bread of chitin in his hand, and he didn't know at the time that he was prohibited from eating this bread because of a shvu that he made. So therefore, there's no option to separate Helm Chayfetz from Helm Shua. Lish Nachrina. Now there are those who take out the words Lish Nachrina because it's just semantics that's going to change, but the Svara presented that there's no way to separate Helm Chayfetz from Helm Shua will be identical to what we just learned. Amalei Abayler B'Yosef, Soif, carbon the Kamaisi, the carbon oil of the earth that you're bringing, Allah the high pass, because you ate this paschitin, mias helm shvu. It's all because you didn't know that what you were eating was prohibited to you due to your shvu. Rabbi Yosef will say no. Kiva the chiyada le the chitin who perished from me, since had he known that the bread that he had eaten, or that he was about to eat, was paschitin and not pasayin as he thinks it is, Helem Chayvetzu, I consider it to be Helem Chayvetz. So in fact, we have a little bit of a disagreement between Abaye and his Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef, that is a distinction. That's something we can refer to as Helem Chayvetz. And Abaye said, no, that would be called Helem Shvua. But again, it's just a question of semantics because we're not, I don't think there's going to be a chiluk halacha between the two. Okay, Gavalti. Actually, that's not true. Forget the Brisa says you only chayv in Helm Shua, not on Helm Chayvetz. So Rabbi Yosef is going to argue on Abaye Lelach, and he's going to say if you had in your hand paschit and you thought you had pasayin, there you would not be chayiv a korban shua, right? Because the Brisa says al Helm Shua at chayiv ve'ein chayiv al Helm Chayvetz, and Vibalt Rabbi Yosef makes that distinction. In this case, there wouldn't be a shua, there wouldn't be a korban, while Abaye holds it would. Boy minei Rav Amir Nach. What about Helem Zev Zebiyada? If you remember, we had this exact shaila by Helem Tuma by Mikdash V'Kadoshim. What if you forgot that you were Tomei and you didn't realize that you were going into the base of Mikdash? What if you had both? So here's the same thing. What if you didn't know that you made the shua and you didn't realize that the chayfetz was the wrong chayfetz? So I guess it would be negeya according to Rabbi Yosy. So Omerlei, he answered back, Haray Helem Shvu B'Yadoi. You have the ingredients that you need. You're able to check off. There's a Helem Shvu over here. More Adarabba. Haray Helem Chayvetz B'Yado you potter. There's Helem Chayvetz, and by Helem Chayvetz you don't bring a carbon oil of the So Amar Vashi, Kazina, you have to do a litmus test. Imach Mashvua Kaparish. If you remind him about the Shvua, that stops him from doing this. Haray Helem Shvu B'Yado. That shows clearly that it was the Helem Shvua that caused him to violate. And therefore he would be chayiv a carbon oil of the earth. But Imach was chayvetz kaparish. If you tell him, whoa, that's wheat, and then he stops, so clearly Helem chayvetz b'yadu upot. Amalei Ravina Ravashi, that makes no sense at all. Halum parish mishvua elam mishum chayvetz. Why, if you remind him you have a shvua, right? That's not enough to stop him from eating what he's eating, unless he also knows that the chayvetz that he has is the chayvetz that's prohibited by the shvua, or klum parish mechayvetz elam mishum shvua. So they're very intertwined. Elaloishna, either way, as long as he forgot that he made a shvua, avada he would bring a korban oil of yari. Baimnei Rav Amir Abnach. Rav had another shaila from Abnach. Let's turn up like this. Eizahi shigagas shavuos pitui lisha avar. So this is now going back. We talked about an oinus. An oinus was when Rav Kahana and who was his chavrusa? Rav Kahana and Rav Kahana and Ravasi. Rav Kahana and Ravasi, when they each swore that they were sure they knew what Rav said, that the Gemara refers to as an oinus. So what is the shigaga that you're going to be chayiv a carbon for? Eze Ezohi shiguga Shavuos Peter l'shavar. Idiyada mezidhu. If he remembered, he's amazed. So Rashi tells us the problem that we're trying to solve. Even the beinin adam b'shvua, right? Adam b'shvua means he had to remember the shvua, right? And if he didn't, he's an oinus, right? So how could you ever have a case of shogeg, right? That was a problem that we started. So either yada, if he knows that when he's swearing about something that happened in the past, he knows that it's not true. That's amazing. He's knowingly swearing falsely. Either yada, if he forgot about what happened in the past, Anasu, as we said on Amar Aleph, right? Each one of Kama and Basi thought that they were right. So therefore, it's an Anus and there's no carbon. So where would you be Mechuyev a carbon? Amalei, I have a very simple answer. I know that I'm swearing that Reuven threw a rock into the river yesterday. And I know he didn't throw a rock into the river yesterday. So I'm 100% amazed. I know I'm swearing false. But I just don't know if you have a carbon. So that's a huge chiddush. We always thought shogeg means you didn't know you're being over. Here you know you're being over, and you're being over b'mezid. But since you didn't know that you would be a carbon for it, that makes it enough of a shogeg that you can bring a carbon. Come on, who says such a innovative type of svara? Munbas said it. The Amar, he said, shigagas carbon shemoshkava. He said that if you just forgot that there's a chi of carbon for it, that's enough of a shogeg. Zok to Gemara, where did Munbas say this halacha? Munbas said this halacha by a regular chi of kares. You ate chaylev, b'mezid, but you didn't know that there would be a chi of carbon for it. That's considered shugah. That's also called shogeg. Zok to Gemara, afilu teimei rabbanan. Even the rabbanan who by a regular chatos don't consider that a shogeg. You know you're eating. You know you're eating a chi of kares. How could you possibly say that's a shogeg? Nevertheless, there's no special chiddush in the carbon, and therefore they would disagree and say, if you know what you're doing wrong, that's not shogeg, that's amazing. Even though you don't know, you'd bring a carbon for it. But here in our parsha of Shavuos Bitoi, the chiddushu, it's a huge chiddush. Why is it a chiddush? The b'chol ha'Torah kula loy ashechan lav the maisi carbon. B'chol ha'Torah kula, the only type of avera that you bring a carbon for is something that if you did it b'mezid, you'd be chayiv kares. You don't find ever in the Torah an avera that you only have a lav if you're over it, yet b'shogeg you'll bring a carbon. That only applies to shvua. So shvua is a very unique type of carbon. The alfinan me'avodah zara. We learn the chiyuv to bring a carbon for a shogeg from avodah zara, who b'mezid there's a chiyuv misa associated with avodah zara. V'hachamaisi, and here you bring a carbon for something that even b'mezid at worst it was only a lav. That's a chiddush b'chlal that you bring a carbon in such a case. Therefore, afilu rabbanim moedu. Therefore, the rabbanim we might do that here, merely not knowing that there's a chi of carbon associated with the Shavuos Bitoi is enough to make it into a shogeg. Gewaltig. Zogt hele Gemara weiter. Tosfos is a very interesting thing. Ravina had a shaila of Rav. So Rava got all of his shailas answered by Rav Nachman, and now Ravina came to Rava to ask him his shailas. Nishba al kikar umistakin aleh. What if you swore that you are not going to eat this kikar, and now you're in a mativ of sakonis nefashis if you don't eat it? Lishre lemar, would it be muter? Rashi says v'chivan the asa l'kamon sharinin le lechatchila. Since if he came to be shoyal on his nether on his shvua because he's in a matz of sakana and he needs to eat it, you would definitely be matter to him. But he didn't come to you, and what happened is he ate it and he forgot about the shvua. So, ma mistaken literally mar. Since you would have been matter the nether had he asked for you to be matter, therefore, if he ate it behelam shvua, he wouldn't bring a carbon. Our shaila is element stire the ochla b'shigugash shvua. What happens if he was mitzdayer, meaning he was very, very hungry? The inami loy nelmami menu hayoichla. And he would have violated his shvua, since he was very hungry, he would have violated his shvua, even if he would have remembered the shvua. He happened to not have remembered the shvua. So he was a case of shogig, he forgot the shvua. But we know that he would not have been able to control himself, and even if he would have remembered the shvua, he would have violated it anyway. My, does that bring a carbon shvua? Omer leitanina, that's a pasha to answer to that. The halacha is, we learn all karbanis only bring a carbon if it's shav miyidiyasai. A mummer who ate chaylev b'shogig, who would have eaten chaylev even b'mezid, he can't bring a carbon for eating b'shogig. So only someone who, had he known that what he's doing is prohibited, he would have refrained from it. If he did it b'shogig, he will be chayiv a carbon. Shav midiyasai may be carbon. But loy shav midiyasai, this is a fellow who you said since he's hungry, he's going to violate his shvua anyway. Therefore, ain may be carbon al shikol, he wouldn't bring a carbon for his shogig. So let's have a look at Tosfos, a very simple Tosfos. How do you know what he would do? I mean, could be this is an academic shaila. Zog to Gemara mitzdayer v'achla b'shogig. Pierce b'kontris. Shafilo yezacher. Even had he remembered that he's not allowed to eat this kikar, hayoichla because he's hungry. Frekt Tosfos. So then, why do you need a case of mitzdayer? You're talking about a guy who doesn't give a hoot about a shvua. He's willing to violate it. To the kasha. It could have just said, what if we know he's going to violate? So he would have answered, Rabbi would have answered, Shabbat Yosy. Why did it have to be a case of mitzdayer? Obviously, there's some justification for him to eat it. Okay, I hear. That mitzdayer means, listen to this. This is a good shmaka twist. This is mamash shmaka. Listen to this. The mitzdayer al masha'in shekeach. He says, if only I would forget the shvua. I wish I would forget that shvua. So he's not thinking, sometimes he would eat it b'mezid. I wish I would forget the shvua. Because if I would forget the shvua, I'd be able to eat it. So he's a guy who would not eat it b'mezid. Not like Rashi says. He's just expressing out loud, if only I would forget the shvua, and then I would be able to. The mitzdayer al-masha'in sheyishkach, he wishes he could have forgotten the shvua, kedei sheyochel. Avul b'mezid, but outright, knowing, then they wouldn't eat it. Upshita, the lav hainu shav midiyasai. This is also lo shav midiyasai. Given sheberitzaina hayishachech kedei sheyochel, so that's also the Gemara Poshit, that's also called einay shav midiyasai. You know, I remember in yeshiva, a guy would say, I wish I would forget that I'm makbid on Chol Yisrael, because there's some ice cream that came that he couldn't eat because he was makbid. I wish I would forget. But he couldn't eat it. Because that's the Gemara right here. Amar Shmuel, Gomar Beliboy, Sarach Shiyoyte B'Svos. Pashat Pshat in these words are, even if you in your mind made up, I'm never going to eat this kikar, that doesn't create a shvua until you actually articulate it with your lips. Shenemar Livate B'Svosai. The pasuk says you have to express it with your lips. I'll show you otherwise. B'Svosai B'Loi B'Leiv. You have to speak it out with your lips, not just think it in your heart. Gomar beliboy minayin. So how do you know from b'svasai mitzmashma you have to speak it out? How do you know that it's also a shvua if you only make up inside your heart, like we say in Hator Sadarim Vafilu Kabbalah B'Leiv? Talmud Leimer l'chayil asher yivate adam b'shvua. Any type of shvua, even if it's only B'Leiv. Frank Gemara, this Bryce is a steer minei obey. Haguvakasha. First you said Amrit b'svasayim v'loy B'Leiv, and then a moment later the Bryce says V'odo Amrit Gomar beliboy minayin. This is how we explain the Brisa. In my heart, I said, I am a Kabul. I decided that I want to make the Shvuah. If you decided that you want to make the Shvuah, but you didn't actually make the Shvuah, that's where it's not a Shvuah. But Gomer Beliba Istam, what if you decided that you want to prohibit yourself from eating this kikar. So then that's a perfectly good commitment, even though you never spoke it out. The only time you have to speak it out is if the thought that you had was to speak it out. But if you never made the commitment, if your thought was, I'm planning to make a commitment by making a verbal shvuah, that thought, that planning stage is not a shvuah. But if the planning stage itself was a shvuah, meaning I don't even plan to articulate it with my lips. In my mind, I'm being makabel not to eat this kikar, that would also be a chiyuv. So Zok but he didn't do it yet. That's not a commitment. But Gomer Beliba Stami 9, how do you know that you could make a shvuah with a Kabbalah of Leib? Problem is, Shmuel Kosher. This brisa is inconsistent with Shmuel, because Shmuel did say quite clearly, Gomer Beliba Tzarech Shiyot B'Svasa. Why did you say, maybe Shmuel means the same thing the brisa meant. Gomer Beliba means Gomer Beliba Lahaychi B'Svasa. So Tosfos says, a Mishnah has that. A Tana doesn't have to be so clear, so he could say that and you could interpret it that way. But it's incumbent upon an Amoira to have been more clear. So therefore, it must be that Shmuel holds that you cannot make a Shvuah through a Kabbalah B'Lev. So Shmuel Kasher, Amar Rav Sheshes Tritz Ve'im Hachi, Bisvasayim, V'loi Shegomar B'Liboy, Lahaitzi Paschitim. He made up his mind that he was going to make a Shvuah that he will not eat Paschitim. But by mistake, the wrong words came out of his mouth. So that's what Shmuel is telling us. If in your mind you had made up to say paschitin, and for some reason the wrong words came out of your mouth, and you said pasoyrin, that would not be a valid shvuah. Gomer beliba loichi paschitin, loichi pastam minayin. But how do you know that if you're gomer beliba loichi paschitin, and you didn't say paschitin, you said pas plain without saying chitin, minayin? How do you know that would be a good commitment? And it only refers to paschitin. So if you made a mistake, then your words don't count. Then it's not a good commitment. But if you didn't make a mistake, you just were vague. You said pas and didn't express what type of pas. We will say that that's a good shvuah, and it refers to the shvuah that you had intended to make, which was paschit. The pasuk says, "Moitza svasecha tishmar." You should keep your word vasisa, and that pasuk is in reference to making a neder to hektish. So it says moitzas vasecha tishmor vasisa kasher nedarta l'Hashem alekecha nedava asher dibarta beficha. So it's a mitzvah to keep your word, and when you make a neder, to fulfill it. Ainly elo asher haisi b'svasa. I would have only thought that what type of commitment is a commitment to hektish if you spoke it out. Gomer believe minayin. How do you know if you made a Kabbalah belief to give something to hektish? How do you know that's binding? So you see from here that just by making a commitment, it's going to be a commitment. So oy bezoi, how come over here you don't say that? So let's see Rashi. It says it by Noid Lavi Carbon. So Zok Gemara, you can't ask me a kasha from hektish that just Gomer Beliba is enough. Because shiny Hazam, the Chsiv Kol Nediv Leit. So the kasha is on Shmuel. Shmuel holds a commitment in your heart is not a good commitment. You have to have spoken it out. So how does Shmuel understand hektish? Hektish, we know for sure. Brisa says Gomer Beliba is enough. Zok Shmuel, it's not a kasha. By hektish it says Kol Nediv Leit. Shiny Hazam, the Chsiv Kol Nediv Leit. So hektish has a separate set of rules because the Torah says Kol Nediv Leit works. So why don't we use hektish as an example? And we'll say, just like my hektish, a commitment, believe in a good commitment, who had in the Cholatar Kula. Truma and Kachim are two ksuvim abam keechad. The whole shnei ksuvim abam keechad ein melamdim. If you hold shnei ksuvim abam keechad ein melamdim, then you have a good answer why a Kabbalah belief doesn't work for Shavuos B'toi. The project of Kol Nediv Leiv applies to Kachim. A regular Shavuos B'toi applies to Chulin. Those are two different domains. You never learn Chulin from Kachim. They have different sets of rules. Now the question here is Truma Kachim. What is the Truma that we're talking about? So Rashi says Truma Kachim the truma is referring to the meleches hamishkan, because by the meleches hamishkan it says kol nadivlei heviu. So the truma is referring to the meleches hamishkan. They got bekachim ksiv b'cheskiyo b'sefer divrayam v'chol nadivlei v'oilos. Tosfos argues on this, and he holds that truma is not kachim. So Tosfos says it's not referring to what Rashi says. So let's look at Tosfos. We should have a truma of a kachim. We have a kachim ksiv shehaviu ba'azara kol nadivlei v'oilos. That's by Ezra. That's the same pasuk that Rashi quotes. The gabi truma ksiv, but by truma it says v'nechshav lachem trumaschem shenitla b'machshav. So Tosfos learns it's literally truma. Rashi learns the truma that the Gemara is referring to is the trumas by the making of the Mishkan. Tosfos learns no, truma means truma. I the avagav the truma choil etzel kachim. I lemaises truma is choil etzel kachim, and we just said you don't learn chulin from kachim because you're in Bereshis Mekadosh. V'lo yalfina mikachim. Gemara mikamokim kachim nilfunei. You still have a tanya that it's next shiva kechad because yes, you have to say the pasuk by truma of kol nadivlei. You wouldn't know from kachim, but once it says kol nadivlei by truma, you didn't need to say it by kachim. You come up with kachim nifluminei. Hilchach have a shnei shiva kechad. Ubekontrish pirish the truma hanging trumas a mishkan the chsiv v'chol nadivlei heviu. Okay, we'll stop here. We'll be mamshich tomorrow. Tomorrow I'm going to be saying shir only on Zoom because I'm driving to Lakewood tonight.
Oh,
Yeah.
what did you have?
Yeah, yeah.
What was this?